Greetings, Old Testament fans. We will be moving into a different body of literature, a different group of authors during our time this week. The second half of Exodus and the entire book of Leviticus might seem a strange combination of texts to put together in a week, but what we'll be focusing on during this entire week is the world of ancient Israelite priests. We're going to focus on the priestly literature that we find in Exodus chapters 25 through 40 during this module. For the second half of this week, we will shift to the book of Leviticus. So the big questions we're going to ask this time are things like, what are priests? What was the symbolic world that priests inhabited? How did they understand the world? What were their theological interests? What were their ethical interests? And so on. And what can we learn about them through the texts that they left behind? But let me start with a blessing. This is an ancient blessing. It also happens to be one of the oldest biblical texts in the world. This is much older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't have a whole lot of things written down from the period before the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were roughly a couple hundred years before Jesus until about 100 years after the time of Jesus. This text, though, comes to us from the 8th century BC. That is sometime around the year 750 or 700 BCE. This is an amulet that would have been worn by a priest. This was found at a place called Ketef Hinnom, which is near Jerusalem. Found recently in an archaeological, recently like in the late 20th century, in an archaeological dig. The text, as you can see here, it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, an ancient Hebrew script. And it includes, it's not exactly the same thing, but it includes basically the same words that we find in the priestly prayer in Numbers chapter 6. That is a familiar one to you, I'm sure. So I'm going to start this class by reading and blessing you with this blessing that has been around. It's some of the oldest. I mean, it's the oldest known biblical text that we have written down that we've found archaeologically. So I'll read it to you in Hebrew, and then I'll read it to you in English. Yabarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Adonai panav eleka v'chuneka. Yisa Adonai panav eleka v'yasem leka shalom. May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make the divine face shed light upon you and be gracious unto you. May Yahweh lift up the divine face to you and give you peace. Shalom. Amen. So, I don't know if you recognize this, but there was a shift in the material for today, in the biblical reading. When you get into Exodus 25, something changes, right? There's something a little bit different. But it's also occurring within this larger body of material, which is the majority of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, where Moses and the Israelites are encamped at the foot of Sinai. So Exodus 25 through 40 takes place in exactly the same place that we've been since Exodus 19. And in fact, they stay there all the way through to Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, when they finally leave the mountain. So all of the second half of Exodus and all of the book of Leviticus take place at the foot of Sinai in the Israelite camp. So we're going to be there for this entire week at the mountain of Sinai. So some fascinating stuff to work through there. We'll come back to talking about Sinai a little bit when we talk about Deuteronomy. But this will be our main focus time, our main geographical location for this part of our text. But like I said, this text itself seems different. If you look at Genesis and Exodus, what we've read so far, there are some priestly materials kind of stretched throughout these texts and sewn into them. Things like priestly genealogies. They're always interested in those genealogies, right? We'll talk about that next time. But also, they're interested in things like rituals. So if you noticed the 2 covenants of Abraham, one of them is focused on a ritual that is circumcision. That's in Genesis 17, and that's a priestly text. The priests are interested in, like in Genesis 1, in things that seem liturgical, that seem to kind of repeat. There was evening and there was morning the second day. It sounds like a liturgy, like a service or something like that, right? So we can see some things about the priests in these texts. But also, if you notice when you entered into Exodus 25 through 50, that's this chunk right here, right? That second half of Exodus. It's almost all or priestly. And then there's this little narrative interjection here from the Yahwist and Elohist, and that is the golden calf narrative, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this module. But we're gonna focus on that blue part there, and then all of Leviticus, you can see, is blue, except for little bits of redactional stuff. We'll get to that as well. But this entire body of literature, you could probably tell, like I said, when you started to read it, when you got into Exodus 25, something changed, right? You weren't in the realm of narrative anymore. You were reading like a technical manual, instructions on how to build stuff, detailed instructions, mostly about spaces and things and sometimes people, right? About how to make stuff, and very detailed instructions about how to make these things. God is a little bit OCD in the Exodus narrative, but we're going to get to why that is important and theologically significant, I think, that God is getting so technical here. As a 21st century reader, no doubt you think this stuff is obscure. No doubt you think it's kind of boring, probably, right? And it all points towards rituals that as Christians we've often been told that we need to ignore. It's bad for us to even think about Leviticus right now, right? And I don't know if you've ever tried to read the Bible, from Genesis all the way through to the end, but you probably crash and burn in Leviticus like everyone else. I'm here to tell you that I think Leviticus is fascinating. It's theologically important, but we have lost the tools to be able to read it and understand what it's saying. The genre, the type of literature that's represented in the priestly materials is really hard to get into unless you already know a lot about the source, unless you already know a lot about their worldview. But once you do, I hope at least at the end of this week, you'll see, and I hope you'll agree with me, that things like purity, holiness, sacrifice, atonement, blood, sin, how to manage sin, reconciliation. These things are really only explored theologically to their full depth in the priestly materials. And if you want to understand the Old Testament, or for that matter, the New Testament, which I know you've heard, talks a lot about sacrifice and blood and atonement and sin, right? If you want to understand all that stuff, the only sources that go really into detail about what that stuff actually is and how it works, that's the priestly material. So that's what we're going to be exploring this time. That end of the Sinai covenant, the end of the Sinai materials, after all the fun stuff with the covenant. But just to kind of start out by talking about that covenant. So the switch from Exodus 24 to 25 is a sharp one, but it makes sense, right? Because in Exodus 24, you can open it up and just kind of look there, the very end of the giving of the law ends with this covenant meal ceremony. Now, in the ancient world, people would eat meals when they celebrated covenants or when they sealed deals. Just like today, when a business person seals a big deal, often they'll take the client out to a lunch or something or a dinner, right? A celebratory meal is a way to kind of extend and sharpen, but also to begin sometimes a relationship, right? So sharing in a covenant meal is an important part of ancient Israelite tradition. And starting in chapter 24, verse 9, by the way, there's some blood stuff in chapter 24 too, right? The blood of the covenant. We'll get back to that. But chapter 24, verse 9, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up the mountain, and they saw the God of Israel. They actually looked at God. Under God's feet, there was something like the pavement of sapphire stone, for the very heaven for clearness. So God lives in a very different kind of place, but still God was kind of coming down to the mountain. God did not lay the divine hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. Also they beheld God, and they ate and drank. So they ate together, they were with God, they were in God's presence. That was the moment of that kind of creation and sealing of the covenant. There's a problem in this text. I don't know if you saw it though. You got the question maybe like, why don't we just do this all the time? Who needs any priestly stuff? We can just eat with meals with God all the time, right? There's a lot of Christians who today would be like, well, just get rid of all that ritual stuff, and you just got to have unmediated access to God, and that's all you need. There's a problem, though, that we see here biblically. Verse 11, God did not lay his hand, as the NRSV translates it, on the chief men of the people of Israel. There's a mention there that God's hand, or kind of power, God's power, God has to do something unusual. God has to withhold divine power in order to make it okay for people to be in the divine presence. There's something going on there that's really important. And then in chapter 25, when we shift to the instructions of the tabernacle, we shift away from the stories about the glory of the Lord being there in the mountain. God says in verse 8 of chapter 25, "And have them make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them." The idea is that Yahweh can't dwell among the people unless there's some kind of mediating space, a sanctuary, a safe space for Yahweh and a safe space for the people. We have the central tension of ancient, and I would say modern theology too, and that's that God is holy. God's glory and holiness poses a problem to people. We are not glorious. We share in God's image, but we don't have this, whatever this glorious power is or something like that. God's glory and holiness radiate out of God and pose a problem. We hear about this later in Exodus, right? That if Moses looks at God, Moses will die. Humans, most of the time, can't get near God and can't see God, or it will hurt us. And God has to do something in chapter 24, verse 11. God refrained from laying the divine hand. Like that's kind of a metaphor for power. God like almost like wore like some sort of protection suit or something, so the divine power didn't get out and kill the people that God was eating with. This is a problem, right? The sanctuary seems to be a space that exists in order for people to meet with God. God's presence is a great, great blessing. We want God in our midst. It's also a big, big problem. The problem is that if God is in your midst, what are you going to do with that overwhelming presence and power of God's glory? You have to have some mediation. The big question of the priestly text is, how do we actually mediate our relationship with God? This problem can be seen in several other texts too, like in Leviticus chapter 10, the story of Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron who offer strange fire on the altar. They don't take the rules very seriously, and as a result, something happens. They die. Some explosion happens or something. They kind of conjure up God's presence and holiness and power, and they don't respect it, but they also don't follow the rules for how to handle it, and it explodes on them. And this is not like God's not happy to do this. This seems to be a tragedy, but it nonetheless happens. And what I would offer you is this, that God's presence is a bit like nuclear power. In the ancient world, deities and like the God's presence was depicted as something that had like overflowing power, usually depicted as both light and sometimes with gods that had horns, signifying like you see images of ancient gods having horns. It almost signifying like their dangerousness, right? And their otherness from you as a human and from me. So I think about this a little bit like a nuclear reactor. Nuclear power plants produce enormous amounts of energy. They also produce a little bit of toxic waste that needs to be handled very, very carefully. But at the same time, they produce the energy, that, at least in some certain places, energy that keeps communities running. That can be a great blessing, and it can be a great burden. So what do they do with nuclear power plants in order to make them not blow people up all the time? Well, they build all these safety mechanisms into it, and they make sure that the people who run these things have high levels of training, that they have manuals that they follow to a very clear detail, right? And that they are probably a little bit obsessive compulsive about following these rules because they know what happens if people don't follow them. That is, people get hurt. People can even die. So if you think about the priestly world and the priestly texts as a little bit like people who run a nuclear power plant, and their job is to keep everyone safe, but also to keep the power going, to keep the lights on, to keep God's presence in our midst. So chapters 25 through 40 of Exodus give us the instructions for how to build the power plant and how to keep everyone safe, but still tap into that power and keep God's presence among us. this is going to require us to step into the world of ancient priests. They had their own symbolic world, we can say. I think we all have. Everybody who's ever lived has had something like a symbolic world. What that means is that we understand certain things in our world, material things, to be powerful or important because they are. But also we understand the world is put together in a certain way. It runs a certain way. And ancient priests had a very clear understanding of the rules of the world. And these rules involved rituals. Now, a lot of people today, modern people, will often, not always, but many people will kind of look down on rituals. They'll say, oh, that's just a ritual, or we don't need to do that. That's superstitious or something, right? I think we all have rituals. Everybody who has ever lived has lived, every human that's ever lived has lived in and has inhabited some kind of ritual world. Anthropologists, many anthropologists, Mary Douglas is a famous anthropologist who has written books to show that ancient people, we can look at their symbolic ritual worlds and we can say that they seem silly or outdated or ridiculous, but she has shown that every single person in the world inhabits a culture that has certain taboos or things you can't do, can't touch. Every culture has things that are pure and impure. Even like modern online social media platforms, right? On Twitter, there are certain things you can say and certain things you can't say, right? There are certain rituals that you have to undergo if you're going to say a certain thing in a certain space. We can see this, anyone who's ever been to an SEC or a Southeastern Conference football game, like the University of Georgia, or an NFL football game for that matter, you've seen rituals at work. You have seen what rituals can do, and in fact are always doing. We all inhabit a ritual world. We sometimes don't see them as rituals, right? But they are. We all use symbols ritually because symbols are things in this world that give us meaning and that anchor our meanings together. So we're always inhabiting this world, and sometimes we just aren't aware of it. Ancient Israelites were very clear about their symbolic world that they were living in, and the priests are trying to explain theirs, but they're explaining it in a way that we've lost the ability to hear. So that's my goal for today, is to have us take seriously the theology, the ethics, the witness of this particular ancient form of conversation that we're engaging in the priestly texts. So this is my little outline for today, just for our module today. We're going to start by talking about the symbolic world of Israelite priests. We're going to talk about some symbolic ideas about purity and holiness and how they're not the same thing. They're linked ideas, but we have to explore them a bit. We're going to talk about holy objects, especially the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to talk about sacrifices, those ritual things that priests did, that ritual activity that priests undertook, that in many ways sustained the relationship between the people and God. And then lastly, we'll walk through Exodus 25 through 40 a little bit. We won't cover this material in as much depth as it should get, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of a taste for some of the interesting things that you can find here. So let's move on. So the first group of ideas that we're going to discuss are holiness and its opposite, not unholiness, but commonness, the holy and the common. And then we'll talk a little bit about purity and impurity. And I think once we get these ideas in place, the priestly worldview will make so much more sense. So, by the way, this is a medieval Jewish illumination. This is a manuscript that medieval Jewish artists have drawn with texts and so on that are on other pages. But here it shows you implements from the temple, holy implements. So the root meaning of the word holy in Hebrew, kadosh, means separate, something that is set apart. It designates something that's withdrawn, like taken away from the world. Think of it as set aside for God's special use in the world. That's my shorthand definition of holiness. A holy thing, a holy object, a holy day, like a holiday, a holy space, like a temple, holy person, like an ordained person. That is something, a person, a day, a space, etc., that has been set aside for God's special use in the world. So, holy things, holy places, holy days, and so on. These things need to be respected and taken care of. Things that are in God's presence need to be holy. God can only be in the presence of holy things. Otherwise, think of the nuclear reactor, right? You're going to cause a nuclear malfunction, right? There'll be an explosion if things that are not holy are allowed to be in God's presence, unless extra circumstances take place. I mean, so when God in Exodus 24 eats dinner on the mountain, somehow God was, they haven't sacrificed yet, right? They just got the laws. They don't have a temple or a tabernacle yet. There's no holiness. God just kind of eats with them. And that's like superseding the normal rules. So in normal rules of operation, God can only be in the presence of holy things in holy spaces and so on. So you can take ordinary objects and turn them into holy objects, but you have to go through certain rituals. There's certain rules, right? A thing that is not holy is not unholy. When I say that word unholy in English, I usually mean something that's bad, like a vampire or a demon or something is unholy. That's not the opposite of holy. The opposite of holy in the Bible is common, just a regular thing. This pencil that I have is not a holy pencil. It has not been set aside for God's special use. No special rituals have been done to it. This is not for priestly use in the temple. It's mine. I use it in my office, which is not a holy space. It's a common space. This is a common pencil. I'm sitting in a common chair. All those books over there are common books. The point being that anything that is not set aside for God's special use in the world is just a regular thing. There's nothing bad about it. Sometimes people also call these things profane, right? It's a profane thing. Well, to us, in modern speakers of English, profane means like using profane language, like cursing, which is not what that means in terms of ancient ritual practice. A profane thing just means a regular thing. It just means not special, set aside for God's special use in the world. And most things in the world are just common. Otherwise, we couldn't use them, right? They would all be in the temple. So, in any event, these things aren't negative. So, regular Tuesday is not a negative thing. It's a good thing, but it's not a special holy day or a space. The Grand Canyon is a wonderful, marvelous space. It's not holy in the sense, if for an ancient Israelite priest, we might use that word differently today, but it's not holy for an ancient Israelite priest because it hasn't been specially set aside for God's special use and habitation, like the temple, or like the tabernacle, the moving temple that we see in Exodus 25. So sanctification means making something holy. Sancta means a holy thing or holiness, a sancta. Sanctification means making something holy. Now, what this means is taking something from the common realm and transferring it into the realm of the holy for use in God's temple. So this image right here of a lampstand, the menorah over there, that's a lampstand. That's the lampstand in the temple. It's also the thing that was understood to be kind of like the closest to an image of Yahweh that you could find. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But the menorah is a sacred object, a holy object that is made by a human being, a regular person, a craftsperson makes it. And it's common. It's a lampstand. But then they have to go through a series of rituals to make this lampstand holy. Some of these rituals include pouring oil over objects, holy oil, and also priests praying certain prayers over these things, sometimes giving them some time for it all to set in, and then you can bring things into a holy space once they've been sanctified. Those are safeguards, right? They're like, it's like the manual, right, for trying to make sure that the nuclear power plant gets run correctly, right? So holiness is not intrinsic to anything. No thing in the world is just holy because it exists that way. There's no holy tree that's just holy because it is, or a holy lamp, or a holy person. You have to do something in order to make things holy. And then it can be maintained, the presence of the holiness of that object, or it can be lost. So if I take something that is impure, we'll get to impurity in a moment. If I get to something that's impure and I touch it to a holy thing, that's going to take away the holiness. It will be defiled or profaned. Again, it's not bad necessarily, but it can't be in God's presence anymore. A defiled lampstand or menorah, I have to take it out of the temple. I have to clean it, wash it. I have to pour it in oil. I have to pray over it. I have to let it sit for a little bit, and then I can bring it back in the temple. It has been sanctified once again or made holy. So again, some modern people will use sanctification in a different way, right? In a modern Christian theological context. But let's try to understand this world of the ancient priests, at least for a little while, on their own terms. So along with sanctification and holiness and commonness, there's another linked set of concepts. These are different, but they're related, and I'll get to how they're related in just a moment. So the concepts of purity and impurity. Sometimes in the Bible, in the New Testament, I'm unclean or something. Clean and unclean are older words used to refer to these concepts, but they're so unhelpful that no biblical scholar wants to use clean and unclean anymore. Because clean and unclean make us think about cleanliness. Like, is a space been mopped? Has it been washed? Have you used Lysol in it lately, right? Have you disinfected it? This has nothing to do with that. Ritual purity and impurity have nothing to do with cleanliness in the way that I would use that word today. A clean space, no microbes or something, right? Or tidy. Has nothing to do with any of those concepts. The temple was the most pure and holy space in all of the world, according to ancient Israelite priests. And guess what? It was a messy, disgusting place, at least the courtyard, because you know what happened there was they sacrificed thousands of animals and blood was everywhere. It probably didn't smell great, at least at times, and it wasn't very clean in the sense of being sterilized, but it was pure. So purity, ritual, purity, and impurity, I'll use ritual here because we'll distinguish it from something else later, but ritual purity and impurity is simply, ritual purity, I'll start there, is simply the property that a thing has, the property that a thing has when it is possible for it to be in contact with the holy. So if something is okay to bring into a holy space, like a person, if I want to go into the temple courtyards in ancient Israel, I would have to make sure I was pure. Now, I'm not holy. I'm not ordained. I wouldn't have been ordained back then. I'm from the wrong family. I'm from the wrong ethnicity, right? I wear glasses, which means that in the ancient world I would have been considered disabled. I couldn't have been a priest, right? So there's a lot of reasons I couldn't be a priest in the ancient world. But all told, if I wanted to enter into the courtyard, I had to make sure that I had kept to the rules of ritual purity. So one thing that we need to start with ritual purity is the idea that it is not sinful. Ritual purity has nothing to do with sin, with ethical failure or moral failure, or it's not even particularly disappointing to God. God doesn't care if things are ritually impure so long as they don't try to come into the sanctuary or that you don't bring them into the sanctuary. Most of the things in the world are going to be impure, ritually impure, just like most things in the world are common. So it's not a problem that something is ritually impure unless you try to bring it into the space in which God is occupying. So one thing is certain things that we do as humans in our lives that we are even commanded to do, told that we have to do, these things will make us ritually impure. So if someone that we love dies, of course we are going to take care of them, take care of their bodies, bury them, perhaps even touch their bodies. In the ancient world, they didn't have houses that took care of this kind of work for people. People would take care of their own families' bodies and remains and bury them. So if someone that you knew and loved died, you would touch their body. This would make you ritually impure, but you had to do it. You had to take care of your relatives. There are other things too. So having sex is not a bad thing in the Bible. Genital discharges of any kind, however, will make someone ritually impure. This just happens. People who, for a male to have some kind of wet dream or a semen emission that's not even rational, or people aren't trying to make these things happen, that would make someone ritually impure, and it's not a bad thing. It's not an immoral thing. It does mean that you need to take certain precautions than if you had scheduled a trip to the temple. So certain things are unavoidable that will make someone ritually impure. Giving birth to a child would make a woman ritually impure for some time. This is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, right? Giving birth is a wonderful thing. So the point I'm trying to make here is that ritual impurity is not about sin. It is not accompanied by any judgment or ethical judgment, so long as people don't come into the temple while in a state of ritual impurity. So contact with corpses, as I said, taking care of the body of someone, but certain kinds of touching dead bodies will also lead to ritual impurity. So these examples show that sex and death are the things that most clearly render someone unclean. That or animals, which are kind of in or out of certain categories of eating. But other things that would make someone ritually unclean are a state like what's called leprosy. There's a modern disease that may or may not be related to the ancient condition that's translated as leprosy. But this was a skin condition in which someone's skin would bleed or ooze or turn white and appear to flake off. These were states that were understood to be, by ancient people, understood to be related to the state of death. It was like someone was a zombie, walking dead, if their skin started to leak some kind of pus or any kind of fluid from the body. So this is why blood is so important. This is why a women's menstrual cycle is really important to the priests and to priestly conceptions of ritual purity and impurity. Just like a man leaking blood from a cut or something like that would also render this person ritually impure. It's not that blood's bad. Blood is good. Remember Genesis 9? Blood was what God wanted to protect and preserve, and in fact made the covenant based on. The point is power. That when a woman gives birth to a child, that woman has just created life in some way. An incredible amount of sacred power has just been let loose into the world. It's the same with blood. Blood is understood to be powerful. It has a power in it, a force of life in it, symbolically, right? In the symbolic world of these ancient priests, it has a kind of sacred power to it. Same thing with death. That death was understood to be a liminal place, a place where you crossed over from life into death, and it was not sinful or bad to die, but it was a time when the power of life in some way changed. There was some sort of status of transformation of power in terms of life. So one other important thing about ritual purity, it's not sinful, right? We said it's not sinful. This is a part of daily life that people have to become ritually impure from time to time. Another thing that's important is that ritual impurity is contagious. That something or someone who has ritual impurity can impart it to another person or object by touching. So if I become ritually impure by touching a corpse, and then I go and touch a sacred object, and then someone else takes that sacred object into the temple, then that impure object is in the temple. It's understood to be a big problem. So ritual impurity is contagious, but it's not permanent. It's not permanent. It's impermanent, right? It's possible for this state to change. There's different procedures that have to happen for different states of ritual impurity. So sometimes it's just the passage of time. Sometimes, like a woman who gives birth has to wait 40 days to go into the temple. So it's not sinful for that to happen, but this is just time is allowed for the power of life-giving force to dissipate before temple access is granted. And the whole idea there, I think, is about it's like the crossing of wires or something, like an electrical circuit. If you take two different powerful electrical circuits and cross wires, that you can make an explosion, or a chemical explosion where you mix two strong chemicals and you can make them blow up. I think this is the idea that the power of creating a new life plus the power of Yahweh in the temple is too much. Boom, it's going to explode. The power of death plus, and Yahweh is understood to be the God who is in charge of life and death. So the power of death plus the power of the temple, boom, things are going to explode. So it's not sinful, it's unavoidable, it's contagious, ritual impurity, and it's impermanent. There are other kinds of rituals that can sometimes that have to go along with purity, like cleansing. This image right here is of an ancient mikveh or bath. If you've ever heard a Jewish friend talk about submersing themselves in water before going into a synagogue, or it's kind of a ritual, recurring thing, going in the mikveh and submersing oneself, is a bit like baptism. They actually come from the same ancient source of immersion in water as a place of kind of spiritual regeneration. Or if you know friends who are Muslim who have ritual ablution or washing themselves before entering a mosque, these are similar ideas. So all to say, and they of course come from historically the same sources. So water, holy water, has this ability to cleanse and purify in some ways. Okay, so that's the system of ritual purity and impurity. Now let me talk about something else. It's confusing because some of the ancient biblical writers use the same word to refer to a different idea. That different idea is moral purity and impurity. Some things are morally pure and some things are morally impure. And this has nothing to do with ritual purity and impurity. So touching a dead corpse is ritually impure, but it's morally pure. It's a good thing to do to take care of the bodies of your loved ones, right? Giving birth to a child is morally pure. It's a great thing, but it is ritually impure. In the same way, there are some things that are morally impure that ritually don't really matter. So all to say, these are two different things. Now, both of them have implications for individuals. Priests in ancient Israel paid attention to several kinds of what we would call like ethical sins, right? Moral sins, especially idolatry, worshiping a false god. We'll talk a lot more about idolatry and what that means as we go on in the course, but I'll just leave that there for now, worshiping other gods. But homicide, killing someone, taking human life and spilling their blood, that seems to be crucial. And then there's a third category of all kinds of sexual transgressions, which usually have to do with in some way violating someone else's covenant. This goes along with the command about idolatry. We haven't gotten to the covenant yet. No, we have. Yes, you'll have talked about the covenant some. We'll talk about covenant more. But all to say that idolatry is kind of a violation of trust with God, right? The idea that we have committed to God and that we are going to violate that trust there's not a ritual element to that that's bad, but a moral element to that that's bad. And the sexual transgressions in Leviticus typically revolve around someone taking advantage of someone else or someone breaking trust with someone else. So these kinds of sins defile the sinner. They actually hurt you and kind of are kind of they're bad, but they also defile the sanctuary. So it's a bit like a magnet in the sanctuary. The altar has these little magnets. The four horns of the altar are magnets that gather the moral impurities of the people. So that they can be taken care of. We'll get to that part later. But all to say that these sins, they defile God's name too, that according to some biblical texts, that God kind of like some of this gross sin stuff like attaches to God, but also the land itself, according to Leviticus, has this residue of these moral failures that kind of can build up in them. And eventually the land can get filled up with them and spit the people out, according to Leviticus. Now, this type of moral impurity is very different than ritual impurity. Remember how ritual impurity was contagious? I could touch something like a corpse and then touch you, and then you would be ritually impure. That's not the case for moral impurity. If I murder someone, which obviously I won't do, but let's just say that I did, the Bible says I can run to a sanctuary and find refuge there. I can grab the horns of the altar and not be executed for what I did, and find some modicum of the possibility for grace. Now, there's a whole process that I have to go through and so on. It's not like murderers just get off scot-free if they touch the horns of the altar. But the idea is that if I touch the altar, I can't bring ritual impurity into the temple, but you can bring moral impurity into the temple because that's where murderers are supposed to flee. So all to say, it's a very different category, and it works in very different ways. It's not contagious. If you murder someone and then touch me, I don't get your moral impurity. It also can't be removed through the same kinds of ritual acts or time in the way that ritual impurity can. You can't just cleanse this stuff away with water. It needs to be actually addressed. There's a whole procedure. This is in Leviticus. Much of Leviticus is about how to take care of these things. It involves sacrifice, which we'll talk about later, but it also involves confession. You have to actually say what you did. And then it also involves most of the sins in Leviticus are that you can get rid of in this way are unintentional. If they're intentional, you got to do even more. You have to actually do reparations. You have to actually pay back the things that you took, sometimes with interest and so on. But then also one other part of it is that you have to invite the people that you've wronged to share a meal with you. And we'll get to that more again in a minute. But you have to regret it. You have to actually be sorry about it. You have to confess and so on. So a person can only regain moral purity by going through this process, which sometimes involves some kind of actual punishment, like banishment. So God's sanctuary can be purified from moral impurity through sacrifice, which is something that we'll talk about later. The purification offering, sometimes referred to as the sin offering in Leviticus, but we'll talk about that more later. But the idea is that this offering doesn't purify sinners of moral impurity. It purifies God's sanctuary of the defilement caused by the sinner's impurity. So we'll get back to sacrifice and how that works in a little bit. But just to say, that's the way this symbolic world is structured and organized. And I think it doesn't serve us well to kind of laugh at these ancient folks and think, or say that it was a silly way for them to think about the world and so on. In part because a lot of the theology of the New Testament is built on some of these ideas. If we see the world through this lens and see it a little bit sympathetically, at least, I think it helps us to see some larger theological statements about who God is and how the world works. So to sum it up, I'm going to move my head here. This is a little graphic to try to help you understand this. Okay, so purity and impurity are linked concepts, right? They're opposites, pure and then impure, ritually pure and ritually impure. This is going to be ritual purity that I'll work with right here, but ritual purity and ritual impurity. And then holy things and common things are, kind of the opposite ends of a particular spectrum. So purity and holiness are not the same thing, but they are different. Remember, holiness was being set apart for God's special use. Common just means a regular thing. Pure means ready to enter the state of holiness, and impure means that you have some kind of ritual defilement, which isn't bad necessarily, but it just means that you're not ready to enter a holy space. Okay, so purity and holiness, green light. If something's pure, it can enter a holy space, right? That's all fine. Impurity and commonness, that's fine. It's not a problem at all, unless you want to enter a holy space. I put yellow here because you got to have a little bit of caution. You don't want to walk into a holy space if you have impurities, ritual impurities, and you are a common. So if I bury my a dead relative or something, I will have ritual impurity, and I'm a common person, and that's fine. God's not mad at me for that. God isn't mad at people who have leprosy or skin conditions. It's not a sinful thing at all. Just can't go into a holy space. A pure object or person, a person who has a state of ritual purity and who is common, that's great too. That's fine. You can go into a holy space. Then you can't go into all holy spaces because only holy people can go into all holy spaces, right? So the green light there is, you can go in the temple if you're pure and holy, a priest, who's been ordained and so on. But if you're a common person like me and you are ritually pure, it's, okay for you to go into at least parts of the temple if you fit certain conditions and so on. The one that you want to watch out for, the nuclear explosion, is if something that is impure goes into a holy space. So this is a real problem here. This is the light, the match that is lit and thrown into the tinder box. So that's where you want to watch out. Okay, so we're going to transition right here to talking about holy objects and spaces and sacrifice itself, and I'm going to break the videos up here. If there are questions about ritual purity and impurity and how that system works, or moral impurity, or holiness, and so on, feel free to let me know in the Ask Anything chat box, in the conversation box. All right, thanks.